G'day everyone, Saxon here. So today I'm just wanting to do a little bit of a talk on the 4 key insights of holistic management. They're very much base concepts that you'll be introduced to when you first start learning holistic management. They are most certainly key to furthering your understanding. Today won't be a deep dive into them. We're just going to be dipping our toes in, just feeling our way around and sort of getting the broad understanding of these concepts. So what are these 4 concepts? First is holism. Second is brittleness. Third is the predator-prey connection. And fourth is time. So the first key insight is holism. The concept of holism was coined in the modern West by Jan Smuts, Prime Minister of South Africa and Field Marshal in the early 20th century. Smuts theorised that nature and natural systems have a tendency not to act as a collective of individuals, but rather as a functioning whole, itself made up of other wholes and itself going on to make up other wholes. So his book was published in 1926 and was Holism and Evolution. But what is the whole? So only the whole is real. So when we have a farm or a property, we often think of these 3 things separately: the economics, the social side of things, and the environment. So this is pretty standard practice. It's compartmentalization and specialization. Not that there's anything wrong with this, but it just makes things a little bit more difficult to manage if you don't consider them all in the same breadth. So we moved on eventually to having interdisciplinary teams, which would consider the environmental, social, and economic side individually and then coming together for a little bit of overlap in the middle. This also still caused problems. Until everyone knows what everyone else is doing and everyone has a clear idea of the whole itself, where the environment, social, and economic aspects are one and considered one thing that we are managing, and there is no individual decision that we may make in any of these environments, in any of these social situations or economies that don't affect all the other social, environmental, and economic aspects of it. So the whole itself is a tricky concept to get when you first start, but eventually you start to get it once you understand how we apply management tools and how you can view the world. So for an example, H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. So consider for the moment the combination of oxygen and hydrogen to create water. Individually, these 2 molecules have a very different set of attributes than when combined to create the new whole of water. They are not merely the combination of 2 molecules, they have completely different behavior when they create a new whole. So let's have a look at oxygen's attributes. It's required for the creation of fire. It oxidizes other elements, corroding them. So think of iron oxide. It can be explosive. It is odorless, colorless, and tasteless, and is a gas at room temperature. Let's consider hydrogen for a moment. It's the first element. It's explosive and volatile. It's a gas at room temperature and is odorless, tasteless, and colorless. So given what we know about oxygen and hydrogen in isolation to one another and in combination next to each other, why would you ever throw water on a fire? It's because the new whole, that is water, when you bring the hydrogen and oxygen together, is a completely different thing. It is not these 2 elements right next to each other. The chemical bonds change the whole. And the same thing can happen in an environment when we choose to add a species, when we remove a species. The same thing can happen in an economy when we choose to add things, remove things, put price caps on things, put subsidies in. There's a lot of unforeseen consequences that happen when we make these decisions, because often we're not considering the whole. We're considering a compartmentalized, just a tiny little bit. We'll fix this one problem. Meanwhile, all these other problems and all these other unforeseen consequences come up. So just individually considering things, just individually considering the hydrogen, individually considering the oxygen, you'd never throw it on a fire. But the whole of water is different to the 2 parts that make it up. There's another key concept that aligns closely with holism, though is separate. A key foundational piece of knowledge is the understanding the differences between what is complicated and what is complex. Often in the common vernacular, these terms are used interchangeably. However, they are different. In the material universe, there are 2 types of systems. There is a hard system and there are soft systems. So a hard system, hard systems are complicated, soft systems are complex. So to properly understand holism, we must understand the two differences between these systems, okay? So a hard system is the creation of a human being. Soft systems are naturally occurring. There are as many hard systems as we create, and it could be argued that there is only truly one soft system made up of an infinite amounts of smaller soft systems. So there is only one whole, and that is the complete material universe, and then you break that down into smaller wholes. So an example of a hard system. Hard systems are complicated. Sorry, not an example, the characteristics of. So a hard system is complicated. It is man-made. Sometimes it's what we would consider engineering. It requires maintenance. It's usually a single unit, a house or a car or a bridge or a computer. The things that we make, the problems are discernible and fixable in a linear fashion. So what do I mean by that? Take, for example, your car. You get your car one day, you put the key in, you turn it, and then nothing happens. You've got to think, right, what's going on? If you put the key in and you turn and there's no lights, there's no sounds, there's no beeping, the engine doesn't kick over, you think linearly. Okay, so it's not a mechanical issue, it's probably an electrical issue. You pop the bonnet up, you have a look underneath. Sure as for whatever reason the battery wasn't connected, you put the battery back on, everything fires away. That's a linear way to fix a problem. So you work backwards. And the problems are usually isolated. Okay, so if the whole car is there, but just this one little thing isn't working, okay, usually it's just that one little thing. So the battery wasn't connected, you put it back on, everything else works immediately. Not the same with soft systems. So soft systems are complex, they are naturally occurring, they are self-ordering. So there's no maintenance required, they will fix themselves, and they will continue to keep on getting on by themselves, regardless of what human interaction is there or is not there. They will self-order. Even humans are a self-ordering complex system with our society and our economy. So they are made up of wholes, and they go on to make up other wholes. They are things that we manage. Problems are difficult to discern and hard to fix. Problems are often intertwined. So take, for example, a lot to do with places here in Africa. There's poverty, there is violence, there is disease, there is famine, there is the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But often those problems go back to a single source, and especially here in sub-Saharan Africa, desertification has a lot to do with that. A lot of people's poverty is based around not having enough natural resources, not having enough food for the cattle, not having enough water for yourself, and the flow-on effects of the breakdown of an ecosystem. So all of those problems really have a root cause in the breakdown of our environment. So a few examples. So examples of things that we make: clothes, cars, vehicles, houses, buildings, hand tools, phones, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, irrigation, and tractors. So they are hard systems. They are things that we make. And then we have things that we manage, which is our family life, a forest, financial markets, community organizations, government, soil biology, ecology, the ocean, and a farm. So now that we have those two lists, have a deep think. Where are the problems of the world? On the left here, we have Elon Musk sending his SpaceX rocket into space. And on the right-hand side there, we have a picture of Skid Row in Los Angeles. This is the same country. There is certainly enough capital where both of these pictures are. There's a lot of money in this country. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot in the United States, and yet the United States suffers from the same problem of dealing with complexity. We are fantastic with the things that we make. We can send a rocket into space, but we can't stop the homelessness problem, the drug abuse problem, the societal decay that the United States is suffering at the moment. So it's a really dichotomous picture. Really good at hard systems, really bad at soft systems. That's because of the human paradigms, because we're not considering the whole. We're focusing very much on linear thinking and on the things that we make. Things that we manage are often a lot harder. Well, they are a lot harder, as you can see. And I'm sure you can find many examples in your own country where this is the case. So our second key insight that I want to cover is brittleness. So brittleness can be defined as the following: the amount and distribution of humidity of the soil surface throughout the year. Okay, so all land environments are somewhere on this brittleness scale. Extremely brittle environments, true deserts, have little to no humidity at any time of the year, and they include the Atacama Desert in South America and Antarctica. So both of them are extremely brittle. There is no humidity. Non-brittle environments have a lot of humidity throughout the year, such as England or the Congo. So brittleness is not rainfall, nor is it temperature. London and Johannesburg have the same amount of rainfall per year, but have very different brittlenesses, resulting in a different environment. Rainfall will affect brittleness, usually because it happens during the rainy season and in seasonal humidity environments, and that's how a lot of humidity happens in those environments, but not exclusively. So brittleness will influence our decisions as to how we can use certain tools in our environment. So the characteristics of brittleness. So a non-brittle environment, there is no bare ground generally, unless we have immediately created it, because it will be covered up in short time. So you can go to Vietnam and plough a field, make it all open, but eventually the forest will come in and cover it up if we rest it for long enough, usually pretty quickly. So there is little seasonal variation in the non-brittle environments. It gets more extreme when you get more brittle. So there is constant breakdown of organic material. So there is no defined periodic decay or cycles of life where there is birth, life, reproduction, death, and decay continuing on and on. They happen all the time in these non-brittle environments. So your insects are your main herbivores usually, and will recover when rested. Whereas in a brittle environment, there is an abundance of bare ground in the absence of properly managed animals. There is strong seasonal variation in some areas, whilst none in the extreme environment. So there's not much difference in the Atacama Desert most of the year, and there's not much difference in Antarctica. It's basically the same, and I'm sure there is a variation, but generally the brittleness does not change. So there is little biological breakdown of material in the absence of animals. Oxidation is the main breakdown, and there's periodic decay. So that's in the absence of either properly managed livestock or properly managed wild animals. And so ungulates are the main herbivores, and seasonal insect populations will occur and will deteriorate when rested. So there's two ways of describing brittleness. Usually it occurs quantitatively as between 1 and 10. So you'd say 1 is a non-brittle environment, 10 is a very brittle environment. Where do you sit between those 1 and 10? It is not an official scale. This is not an exactitude. There isn't an environment that's exactly 5.5672 on the brittleness scale. It's really just to give you a general idea of where you sit. That's why I prefer the qualitative version, which is non-brittle or non-brittle tending, and then you have brittle or brittle tending. So they're the four really easy choices you have, and I'd suggest using them. It's a lot easier. Here's a picture showing between sort of 1 and 10. So on the left-hand side, we have a tropical environment, clearly non-brittle, and on the right-hand side, we have a very brittle environment. It looks like the Sahara or the Arabian Desert or something like that. So you can choose to use this. You can use the qualitative example, but either way, just so long as you understand that there are environments wherein there is seasonal humidity and there is environments where there is constant humidity. And we will choose to apply tools in certain ways in those environments that we wouldn't otherwise do in the other environments. So here's an example of a brittle environment and how it changes throughout the year. So you can see early on in the year where there's a growing season, so there's rain and humidity, the plants grow and the insect and microorganisms increase until you see that line growing straight down, which is usually around the last rain. And when the temperature starts to change, your insects and your microorganisms decrease because everything dries out. There is no ambient humidity at soil surface. And so there's a massive death of above ground plant material, and that will slowly go down until we go to the next growing season. But in that time, what happens to that material? Well, there's only one place in a brittle environment that never dries out and never goes brittle, and that is the stomach of ungulate animals, the grazers and the browsers. Their stomachs will always be non-brittle, and they will always have microorganisms in them. And so that is how you maintain the microorganisms and the breakdown during the non-growing and dormant seasons in those particular environments. It is only the animals can do this. There's no other piece of technology. Fire won't do it. Nothing else will do it. It'll only be the animals. So we'll have a quick look at the world map here. So we can see basically the areas that are brittle and basically the areas that are non-brittle. And the brittle environments are clearly dry deserts, and the non-brittle are green. But as you can see, that is quickly changing around the world. There is an increase in the brittle environments, increases in desert, and that's due to a lack of ground cover. If you change enough of the environment, the brittleness will change. There's very few places that I can think of that will maintain humidity if you remove all the vegetation. You'd be definitely changing the climate of that particular area if you were to remove all the ground cover. So brittleness does change over time. It is part of climate change. It does change due to partly because of our management, partly because of things that are out of our management's control. But we can see basically on the map here where the brittle environments are. And so we'll have to think about when we're in those environments how we're going to use certain tools. And so one of the effects when you over-rest a grass plant, i.e. you haven't grazed the previous growing season's growth off it by the time the next growing season comes around, that becomes a problem. As you can see here in the photo, we've got an oxidizing perennial grass plant. So that grass plant is, you can see where all the grey is. That's usually, I think it's 2 to 3 years of not grazing. So what's happening is all of that grass is sitting on top of the crown of the plant, and so there's no way for those leaves that are beneath there to actually get any sunlight and grow again. And so that eventually will kill this plant unless it is grazed. Often the older paradigm was to just burn it, but in a lot of circumstances that's not the correct thing to do if we want to enhance our environment. There are ways that we can do that with burning, but that's for another time. But this is what happens when we over-rest grass in a brittle environment. And so here's over-rested ground in a brittle environment. So if we are to remove all the animals, so just thinking about this is what happens when we remove the tool of grazing. So we haven't used the tool of grazing here, we've just let the plant rest. And this is what happens when we remove the tool of animal impact from the environment. So animal impact is everything that an animal does that isn't grazing. So it's dunging, urinating, slobbering, and trampling and breaking up the capping on the ground. And so that's what happens here. There is a thick crust of algae and lichen on the top of capped soil. And so as you can see with the Swiss Army knife there, breaking open that capping, that environment is in a state of decline because the animals have been removed, and that capping will continue to get harder and more pervasive until eventually all those grass plants you see there will be dead and everything will be turning into a desert. So this is what happens in a brittle environment. So just remember, seasonal humidity environment when we remove animals.